If you want to support the channel, then please check out my Patreon page to gain access to exclusive videos, take part in Q&As, and watch my retrospectives before they go live on YouTube. Just recently, the long-awaited documentary detailing the battle between Sega and Nintendo during the 90s, titled Console Wars, arrived on streaming, based on the popular book of the same name from 2014, written by Blake J. Harris. Blake started investigating the history of Sega and Nintendo in 2011. He went to his local bookshop and discovered there was little to no books on the history of video games. All he could find were player's guides for the latest titles. He did some research online and there was some books that had been written that were no longer in print, such as Game Over, about the rise of Nintendo from the 80s, published in 1992. A lot of the history that has been covered was the video game crash of the 1980s and the rise in popularity of the personal computer. So he set about researching Sega and Nintendo's history to produce his own book focusing on gaming of the 90s. Blake wanted to find out about the behind-the-scenes antics of Sega and Nintendo during the days of the battle for dominance in the market with the NES versus the Genesis and then the Super Nintendo. As Blake started his attempts to gain access to the people at Sega and Nintendo, it proved a challenge as he had no writing credits to his name, so it was an uphill struggle to get people to be open with him and discuss their past. Once he got through to Tom Kalinske, who was the head of Sega of America during its heyday, doors began to open. Nintendo would be the most difficult hurdle, as they were very secretive and a closed-off company. Blake would have a long process of getting through to Howard Lincoln, who was the CEO of Nintendo during the 90s. Those involved with Nintendo were very protective of the company, and mentioning Sega brought back bad memories, but they were eventually persuaded to chat about their experiences as they didn't want the story to be one-sided and from the perspective of Sega. Blake sent his treatment to actor Seth Rogen and writing partner Evan Goldberg in 2012. Feeling they would have a keen interest in the Sega vs Nintendo story. They both loved it and shared a similar experience to Blake with video games, and they would provide a foreword in the book. They also purchased the rights to produce a feature film and a documentary. So for this documentary, the story details the journey of Tom Kalinske, who had worked for Mattel reviving the Barbie line and launching Masters of the Universe. He'd stepped down from his role at Mattel to work for the rival company Matchbox. He was offered the job to work for Sega in 1990 to be their new CEO of their American division. Tom didn't know much about video games, but agreed to take the job, seeing the potential in the electronic gaming market, but found the US division to be in disarray and needed to build up the awareness of the new Mega Drive or Genesis for those in the USA, as the USA experienced a video game crash in the 80s with the failure of Atari and the game E.T. The market got scared of video games and it was seen as a dead business. Then came Nintendo and their new 8-bit system that changed everything in 1985. It would become the most-have toy for kids and the most wanted item every Christmas for the next few years. The company had a firm grip on the market, and Sega found it difficult to break in with their Master System and couldn't make a dent in the US market, unlike in Europe where it gained a healthy market share. The new 16-bit Genesis arrived in 1989, but wasn't flying off the shelves as expected. Tom's first decision was to bring in more licenses and get celebrities involved, create an aggressive marketing campaign, get more retailers to sell the Genesis, and swap out the packing game with one to defeat Super Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog, which shocked Sega of Japan, but the head of the company, Hayao Nakayama, and his epic comb-over gave Tom free rein to do what he wanted, putting full faith in Tom turning the tide in Sega's favour, and over the next couple of years Sega would take over 50% of the market share thanks to its edgy advertising and appealing to not just kids but teenagers and adults. Nintendo was seen as a family-friendly company and is still seen as that today, and Sega saw that older gamers were being left out and aimed to capture their attention, and succeeded. The Genesis quickly outsold Nintendo's new console, the Super Nintendo, making it the first time since 1985 that the company did not dominate the home console market. To add further distance between them, Nintendo censored Mortal Kombat following a public outcry about the violence. Sega left the violence in, though only accessed by a cheat code, but the game sold far better on the Sega console. Tom started to look to the future and had talks with Silicon Graphics and Sony about teaming up to create the next 32-bit console, but Sega of Japan had started to ignore any ideas from the American team, with some suggesting the Japanese division were getting jealous of all the success Sega of America was having, as the Mega Drive was in third place in its home territory of Japan. The Japanese division moved forward with plans for the Sega Saturn. Sony would eventually enter the console market with the PlayStation, and Nintendo would ignore the 32-bit generation and go straight for 64 bits, partnering up with Silicon Graphics, leaving Sega with a console designed mainly for 2D gaming, with complicated internal technology making it difficult to program for. Sega then struggled with the next generation of gaming. This led to Sega being one of the most dominant gaming companies of the 90s to fall out of the console market over the next few years, and became a shadow of its former self. I had read Console Wars only last summer and had no idea the documentary would be coming out this year. It's taken a while for it to actually get released. There was talk going around that it was going to be a feature-length film or going with a mini-series approach, but a documentary was always going to be its main goal at first. I really enjoyed reading the book, despite knowing quite a bit about the battle between the two gaming giants. Its most interesting aspects were the personal stories from the employees at each company. From a UK perspective, there was no video game crash, and the battle between Sega and Nintendo seemed far less aggressive in the UK. The battle would be between your friends in the playground. Which was better, the Mega Drive or Super Nintendo, very much like the kids of the 80s who argued over the strengths of the Commodore 64 over the ZX Spectrum. It's all just nonsense really, as what was most important was the quality of the games and not the graphics. The documentary did a pretty good job of condensing the book and getting the key points across, and follows the book's structure quite closely, with Blake Harris co-directing it with Jonah Tulis. Blake has maintained the key elements of his story. The story is mostly focused on Sega and them being at the bottom and fighting their way to the top, and then falling from grace with the launch of the Sega Saturn, which is always an interesting narrative with the rise and fall scenario. Nintendo was seen as the enemy. They had made it difficult for third-party developers to produce games for other platforms. They wouldn't allow retailers to discount their products. Nintendo was very smart and had a firm grip on the market, and weren't going to compete with Sega with its somewhat cheap marketing tactics, but continue the course in what they do and focus on providing great games and get better at it. But they did begin to see Sega as a major threat, as by the release of Sonic 2, things had swung in Sega's favour. Kids were no longer desperate for a Nintendo for Christmas, but a Sega. The documentary has a great lineup of the key players at Sega and Nintendo. It makes good use of archival material such as news reports, commercials, people's own home videos, also with some added 16-bit style graphic sections to break up the talking heads footage, feeling inspired by Streets of Rage in some sequences. There are elements of this period of time that I felt were left out, such as Sega focusing on the add-ons for the Mega Drive with the Mega CD and 32X, and its dominance in Europe, as it's very much focused on the USA perspective. Like a lot of video game related documentaries in the past few years, they are very much focused on the US gaming market, which honestly isn't as varied or interesting as Europe. Other moments left out in Nintendo's history was their battle with the Game Genie. They just cover the company's aggressive methods with just a quick discussion on lawsuits. For the third act, once it gets to the failed Saturn launch, and Tom stepping down from the company as their CEO in 1996, it sort of abruptly ends, which is keeping in line with the book. But I think more time could have been dedicated to this area for a bit longer, but that's just nitpicking. Running at 90 minutes long, it did whiz by, which is a great indicator that it held my attention. But they could have added a further 15 minutes to its runtime to flesh out some sections to offer the definitive story of these two companies during the 90s. If you are a fan of retro gaming, and I'm sure you've all watched videos on YouTube about gaming history, it's hard to find anything new in this documentary. The book itself has been mined for information over the years, so it becomes a challenge for this documentary to fulfill its job of offering something new to the fans who are already over familiar with the history of Sega versus Nintendo. If it was released a few years earlier, then it may be less of an issue. I'm not sure why Console Wars took so long to come out, maybe due to legal clearance perhaps. This is really for the casual fans and lovers of documentaries in general, who don't necessarily follow the retro gaming scene and haven't done any reading into the battle of Sega and Nintendo during this important time in gaming history. Experiencing these consoles when they came out was pretty magical. Playing Golden Axe on the Mega Drive for the first time, or experiencing F-Zero on the new Super Nintendo was just amazing. Whenever I look back at Sega in particular and its history, it's deeply frustrating how things panned out. It's such a shame Sega of Japan didn't follow the advice of Tom and didn't trust his instincts, which they had done before, but had this sudden change in attitude. And who knows, Sega's next console could have been onto a winner, and things would be a lot different today. But saying that, I love the Sega Saturn and it remains one of my fondest memories as a gamer, but the opportunities Tom had to work with either Sony or Silicon Graphics could have been a successful combination, and we could still see Sega as a dominant force in the console market today.